fourth and final speaker is Dr. Patrick Keenan from our University of Illinois College of Law. He also heads the College of Law's International Human Rights Clinic. His scholarship explores the connections between human rights, economic and financial regulation, and international law. I'll just give you the titles of a couple of his publications so you know the kind of things he works on. One of his publications is Sovereign Wealth Funds and Social Arrears. Should debts to citizens be treated differently than debts to other creditors? Another is Financial Globalization and Human Rights. So he's going to explore briefly a quite different set of issues.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you again to the organizers and to the previous speakers. You've heard a lot about the situation, and so I will not talk about that part. So I think that what I will focus on is what next. I think that the deep history of the roots of the problem and the way that this problem permeates every aspect of society and the daily life, the lived experience of the Rohingya people, I think that that's fairly well established. And so I'm not going to cover that ground. As was said, I'm trained as a lawyer. I work as a professor and lawyer still. And so I want to kind of pick up on and maybe take the next step from Benjamin's remarks, which opened this panel, which is a catalog of what the rights are. So there are legal obligations that already exist that are well documented and incontrovertible. There's not a lot of controversy about what the legal rights are. And there's also another catalog of potential sources of legal rights, the provisions that he mentioned that could be adopted. The problem with this, though, is that the same sovereign that is doing the oppression is the place to go to ask for the oppression to stop. And so what I want to talk about is ways to handle this. This is a situation that's not uncommon, where you have rights but no remedy. You have a legal claim to make but no forum in which to make it. Where would you go for this petition? So appeals to the government, to conscience, to law, so far are not working. And that doesn't mean abandon them. The deep history, the lived experience, the knowledge about rights is important, and that is a track that has to be followed. But looking forward and looking just at the events in the past 30 days or so, that should do two things. One is it should give greater urgency to the work of advocates and activists. But also, there are some small glimmers of optimism. I think that the three factors that suggest to me that there are avenues, at least some avenues, new avenues for redress, are integration, trade, and aid. Seeing that the EU and the World Bank in particular are providing aid packages is very encouraging to me. It's encouraging because the provision of money will help poor people, or at least has that potential. That's the easy part of it. That's not part that I'll talk about. And many of us who are at least old enough to remember the bad old days of conditionality remember when aid came with onerous conditions that were destructive of societies. But in all of the documents in the EU, especially for the EU and the World Bank, the aid doesn't come in exactly that way anymore. The provisions, the terms of those contracts contain within them legal rights and possibilities for remedy for individual people or for groups of people who are harmed. There are a couple of examples that I want to mention, and then I'll leave plenty of time for discussion. When Haiti this is a decade ago, had electoral violence and the elections were just stolen, the EU suspended aid, and the suspended aid based on the provisions that said you can't do that. Once you're receiving aid from the EU, there are legal provisions, and so the EU suspended aid. This was profoundly disruptive, and it affected poor people, but it gave the EU and it gave other funders some leverage. And it didn't give leverage in the way that conditionality used to say revamp your whole economy and reprioritize according to what we tell you your priorities should be. Instead, it placed limits on the kinds of behavior that the government could get away with. Because when the government is the oppressor, where do you go for redress? There is no other place. There's no international police force. The International Criminal Court is not going to do anything. The fact that the UN Charter says you can't do this is important, and it's important to name those rights. But you can't go to the UN and say, well, we need redress. The UN doesn't work that way. But looking at, and this is the thing that I think is the most important, that advocates have been using a very traditional approach. Not all, of course, have been using a very traditional approach, which is name the rights, appeal to conscience, and bear witness to the kinds of oppression. But there are other ways. So I think with the EU providing funds that contain within them specific provisions for the suspension of funds, that gives leverage. It's not perfect. It's the second best solution. It would be better if the government changed the law. But that seems, at least in the short term, an unlikely prospect. At least unlikely without the use of this other leverage. There are similar provisions in the World Bank's provision of aid, or at least the recent agreements to provide aid. Protection of minority rights, protection of women and children, and the ways that internal decisions have to be made. This, again, it's not a perfect solution, but it's another avenue for advocates that are looking, I think, with great urgency for places to go. There are some historic examples that I want to mention just to kind of flesh out what I'm talking about. We heard before about the principles that you can't, of non-refoulement, so you can't force someone out of their country if there's no place, or force a refugee to leave if there's no place that will take that person. This was a common problem in West Africa in the late 80s and throughout the 1990s. And that problem is certainly not solved, but it was resolved in some ways because of economic interests, because when companies saw that they couldn't do business where they wanted to do business unless the governments of those places reform their policies, that's when reform started to happen. So if you look back at the submissions by companies to the U.S. government about the extension of trade preferences, for example, to Ivory Coast, what they talked about were conditions of economic activity, but also human rights of individual people. We have to stop and recognize that when you're appealing to companies to help you protect your human rights, you're in desperate straits, right? That's not where we think we should be. But I think that's where we are, and it would be, I think, short-sighted to not recognize that. There are a number of other examples, but in the interest of time, I won't dwell on them now. I know that there are lots of things that people want to talk about, but the focus of what I'm saying is that the traditional avenues of advocacy to try to convince people who are or were or should be thought of as moral leaders to get on your side and to convince the government based on the description of the oppression and the lived experience of people, that's all important, but it's not working. And there are reasons, because of integration with the increased integration with the international community, the aid that's coming, and the trade that is coming and will come because of the kinds of energy exploitation that we saw, they provide at least some reasons for optimism. And this is where I think advocates, especially, and this is perhaps parochial, lawyer advocates can be most helpful. Most historians don't want to spend their time on contract terms. It's something that you read to go to sleep at night. But that's where the rights are. The right to petition the government doesn't mean a whole lot as things exist now. But there are other avenues for seeking redress and for exerting leverage. So I'll close there in a very truncated way and encourage lots of discussion. Thank you.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.